Good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming along again this evening. Um, I'll carry on from where I left off last week, and thank you, Claire, for introducing it. If you were here last week, you will remember that I um, finished by looking at the poll tax debacle and which led to the resignation of Margaret Thatcher, or at least a challenge to her leadership of the Tory party. It was Michael Heseltine that challenged her. Hang on, here we go. It was Michael Heseltine that challenged Thatcher for the Tory leadership, and Thatcher didn't get the required 15% majority in the first round and was persuaded to withdraw from the second round of voting, ending her 11-year reign as Prime Minister. John Major, Chancellor of the Exchequer, then contested the second round and beat both Michael Heseltine and Douglas Hurd, thus becoming leader of the Tory party and becoming Prime Minister. Um, by this time, Britain had slid into recession for the third time in 20 years, and unemployment was rising once again. This was one of those periodic slumps that capitalism is well known for. And the polls were once again showing the Tories to be deeply unpopular. So, what was Major's answer? The usual one: let's go to war. So he committed British troops to fight with the United States in the first Gulf War of 1991. So, despite the recession deepening throughout 1991 and into 1992, with the economy falling and unemployment rising to over 2 million, polls improved for the Tories. Major then called a general election in early 1992 and won. But as usual, the British press, which, as we all know, is overwhelmingly right wing because it's run by multi billionaires, um, the British press, especially the Murdoch press, derided the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, who was a kind of soft left leader who had replaced the more traditionally left leader of the Labour Party, Michael Foot. On the day of the 1992 election, the Sun ran this headline on the left, followed the day after the election with the second headline, "It's the Sun what won it." In other words, they took credit for a Tory victory. Um, if we compare what happens with the British press and our elections. In France, for example, this kind of blatant electioneering didn't used to be allowed in France for 6 weeks before an election. It's now they can, but there are much stricter rules, and the media can't interfere in elections and electioneering for 44 hours before an election. So they certainly couldn't do this the day before an election. And as I say, at the time, remember the Tory press and especially the Sun had a huge and unhealthy influence over voting intentions. In fact, Rupert Murdoch, the Sun's owner, was a frequent visitor to Number 10, telling successive governments what he and his papers expected from them. Now, I suppose the question is, do you think that with the advent of social media, that the newspaper's influence has waned? And if it has, to what extent has it waned? That's one question. But Kinnock, who had been Labour leader since 1983, had already been moving the Labour Party to the right. In 1986, for example, he led the campaign to expel members of the militant tendency, a Trotskyist faction within the Labour Party, which culminated in the expulsion of Derek Hatton, who at the time was deputy leader of Liverpool City Council. The decision followed a prolonged internal struggle, with Kinnock arguing that militants' activities violated the Labour Party's constitution by promoting a separate political programme and of engaging in entryism, completely ignoring the fact that there were a number of other groupings in the Labour Party who had separate agendas. Hatton was expelled after being found guilty of membership of the militant tendency and of manipulating local party rules, despite the fact that he refused to attend the disciplinary hearing. So the move was part of a broader purge initiated after the 1985 Labour Party conference, where Kinnock had delivered a major speech denouncing militant, particularly its influence in Liverpool. The purge significantly reshaped the party's internal balance, weakening the left wing and enabling Kinnock to steer Labour towards a more centrist policy platform ahead of the 1987 general election, which Labour lost. If you don't know the history, militant tendency eventually became the Socialist Party. Now, I'm not a member of militant tendency, or wasn't, and I've never been a member of the Socialist Party, but personally, I think this kind of witch hunting is something that ought to be avoided. Um, After Kinnock lost again in 1992, he stepped down and was replaced by John Smith, who sadly died 2 years into his tenure as Labour leader. Meanwhile, Major's government launched the Back to Basics campaign aimed to revive traditional British values such as neighbourliness, decency, courtesy, self-discipline, respect for the law, and family responsibility. With regard to this last one, family responsibility, this was despite the fact that we discovered only in 2002 that at the time he was having an affair himself with backbencher Edwina Currie between 1984 and 1988, even though both of them were married to other people. But the slogan was intended as a nostalgic appeal to core values and a response to social changes since the 1960s sexual and cultural revolutions. Despite Major's insistence that the campaign was not a crusade about personal morality, it was widely interpreted as promoting the social conservatism of Thatcherism, especially around family structures and sexual conduct. This interpretation spectacularly backfired at the time after a series of high-profile scandals and sleaze involving Tory politicians. Nothing is new. A good example of that sleaze was Tim Yeo, a Tory MP who fathered an illegitimate child while the Tories were extolling the virtues of marriage before sexual relations. This is just one case amongst many that exposed their hypocrisy and double standards. As far as I'm concerned, I don't give a shit who people have sex with. But when you do that and you're telling the electorate to do something different, that's a different matter altogether because that's hypocrisy and double standards. And it's that kind of hypocrisy and double standards that undermined the Tory government's credibility. They became symbols of political irony, with critics highlighting the contradiction between preaching traditional values and the private lives of those in power. The point, however, is that while the campaign failed to deliver major policy changes, its themes of personal responsibility and law and order influenced other political and later political agendas, including those of so-called New Labour and Rishi Sunak's 2023 long-term decisions for a brighter future strategy. Going back to the Labour Party, following the untimely death of Labour leader John Smith in 1994, the Labour Party elected Tony Blair as its leader. He rebranded the Labour Party as New Labour. It was claimed that it was modernising the party to improve its electoral prospects in a political landscape dominated by neoliberalism. The term New Labour was first used at the party's 1994 conference and became synonymous with a shift away from traditional socialist policies. Key elements of the rebranding included dumping the red flag as its logo in favour of a red rose, reducing the influence of trade unions in party affairs and funding, and shifting towards greater ties with the business community, embracing market economics while emphasizing social justice, equal opportunity, creating a so-called meritocracy, and public service reform. It included adopting modern political techniques like focus group research, media management, and strategic branding, influenced by figures like Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell, and crucially and most significant of all, revising Clause 4 of the party's constitution. Clause 4 of the party's constitution was a commitment to common ownership of the means of production. And this signalled a move away from state ownership towards what Blair's sociologist guru, who I've met on several occasions being a sociologist, Anthony Giddens, called a third way between capitalism and socialism. Now, after all the sleaze scandals, the Tory party collapsed into political infighting. It came to a head when the majority of Tories failed to back Major's deal over the Maastricht Treaty. Labour won the 1997 election under Blair with a landslide victory, promising a celebration of a modern, outward facing Britain with a new kind of workforce based on the cultural industries. The Gallagher brothers, David Bowie, and many other celebrities like them were invited to celebrate this at number 10. Labour secured 418 seats, which was a majority of 179, marking the largest electoral victory in the party's history and ending 18 years of Conservative rule. The Tories were reduced to just 165 seats, their worst defeat since 1906. Tony Blair, at the age of 43, became the youngest Prime Minister since Lord Liverpool in 1812 and the first one born after the Second World War. Well, there were some good early signs with the Labour government. First of all, devolution for Scotland and Wales. They set up referenda in which the Scottish and Welsh electorate voted for devolved assemblies. They brought in the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland. In 1998, Mo Mowlam, who was the architect that established a devolved Northern Ireland Assembly, even went into the H blocks to talk to IRA prisoners of war who were on hunger strike. It is worth noting at this point that Jeremy Corbyn had been talking to IRA leaders for some time to get negotiations going, something for which he was vilified in the Tory press for supposedly supporting terrorists. Um, they early on, the Labour government also ploughed massive investment into health and education. Um, also, sorry, no, before that, introduction of the minimum wage in 1998. Um, this was after John Major had disbanded the remaining wages councils that I talked about last week, where, for low paid workers. So low paid workers had been left with absolutely no protection from unscrupulous sweatshop employers. So Gordon Brown brought in the minimum wage in 1998. Um, so massive investment in health and education. These were areas that were particularly underinvested in during the Tory years. As a consequence, unemployment fell dramatically. They brought in the Human Rights Act in 1998, the Freedom of Information Act in 2000. Most hereditary peers were removed from the House of Lords in 1999, and they brought in the Civil Partnership Act in 2005. This allowed gay couples the right to register their partnership, giving them similar rights and responsibilities to heterosexual marriage. However, there were a number of things that they did which weren't quite so good. They introduced university tuition fees. Like primary and secondary education, university education had previously been free, totally free. Indeed, university students used to also get a maintenance grant to be able to live independently while at university. something that I and many other working class people benefited from. The Bank of England was given the power to set the base rate of interest autonomously. Chancellor Gordon Brown's decision was, not surprisingly, popular with the city, who New Labour had been courting for many years. They didn't abolish any of the Tory anti-union laws, something that Labour had promised to do when in opposition. The private finance initiative was introduced by Major's Tory government, but it was massively expanded under the Blair government. What the private finance initiative did was allowed public services, especially the National Health Service, to fulfill shortfalls, build new units, or even build new hospitals with finance from the private sector on long-term loans. However, the interest rates were so prohibitive that many National Health Service trusts that were using their funds just to make sure that they didn't default on their loans, that they'd never be able to repay, whilst the private sector continues to make huge profits from their investments. Many of them are still paying off those debts and they'll never pay them off. So when you see how much more money has been put into the health service by government, just bear in mind that a lot of it goes to paying off debts to private companies. But worst of all was the Blair government's warmongering foreign policy. And this started on September the 11th, 2001, when a series of coordinated terrorist suicide attacks was carried out by Al Qaeda. 19 terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes, crashing 2 into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers in New York City, 1 into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, and the 4th one crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, after passengers attempted to retake control of the plane. The attacks prompted the US President George W. Bush to launch his war on terror, including invasions of Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. As part of NATO forces, Blair's Labour government sent troops to support Bush in both wars. If we look at Afghanistan first, the Taliban government in Afghanistan was hosting Al Qaeda training camps that were responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Now, the stated aims of the war was to topple the Taliban government, build democratic institutions, and prevent the country from becoming a terrorist haven. The war lasted 20 years from 2001 until 2021, when the US and NATO forces were withdrawn. Despite significant military and financial investment, the US, for example, spent $2.3 trillion on the war. It ended with the Taliban's rapid offensive and the re-establishment of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, reversing many of the social and political gains made during the previous 2 decades. The war resulted in over 200,000 deaths, including 46,000 civilians, with 2.6 million Afghan refugees and 4 million Afghans internally displaced. So, what was it all for? In 2002, the US president then started to assemble what he called a coalition of the willing to attack Iraq on the flimsy excuse that under Saddam Hussein, Iraq was part of the terrorist axis of evil and that they were developing weapons of mass destruction. Now, it is true that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, but he hated Al Qaeda and all that they stood for as much as the West did. Furthermore, US inspectors could find no evidence that the regime were developing weapons of mass destruction. It was suspected very strongly that the US really wanted to get at Iraq's oil reserves. Nevertheless, Blair wanted British forces to join the coalition of the willing with his mate George Bush. He described him as his mate, a right-wing Republican who he had a special relationship with. In February 2003, 2 million people marched in London against going to war with Iraq. It was the biggest demonstration ever in Britain. It included me, my wife Sue, my son Nick, and his then girlfriend. With Nick's permission, The Guardian used Nick's photos in their reporting of the event. In wanting to join the coalition of the willing, Blair was wary of making direct appeals for regime change in Iraq because international law doesn't recognize this as a ground for war. Iraq, its infrastructure of concealment, deception, and intimidation, was what was called the dodgy dossier. The dodgy dossier refers to this document, which was produced by the British government in February 2003 by Alistair Campbell, Tony Blair's Director of Communications, in other words, his spin doctor. It was intended to bolster the case for military action against Iraq by highlighting the threat posed by Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction program. It was a doctored PhD thesis available on the internet, and they didn't attribute it to its author. The term dodgy emerged due to revelations that the document simply plagiarized content from this 2002 academic thesis by a PhD researcher. Sections on Iraq's security apparatus were copied verbatim, including typo errors, with only minor edits to make the tone more alarmist, such as changing one phrase, monitoring foreign embassies, to spying on foreign embassies. The original thesis, the PhD thesis, simply hypothesized about possible weapons of mass destruction, whereas the Downing Street version presented the ideas as if they were fact. The dossier also became infamous for the 45-minute claim, a statement that Iraq could deploy weapons of mass destruction within 45 minutes of an order which was widely cited by the media and used to justify the war because it said we can strike Western installations within 45 minutes. However, this claim was based on intelligence assessments that were later found to be overstated and misleading because no weapons of mass destruction were ever discovered in Iraq after the 2003 invasion. Furthermore, Hans Blix, who was head of the UN Monitoring, Verification and Inspection Commission, led a team that conducted about 700 inspections at 500 sites in Iraq between November 2002 and March 2003. Despite these extensive searches, no evidence of active weapons of mass destruction programs were found. Blix consistently argued that the US and Britain relied on flawed and over-interpreted intelligence, particularly regarding Iraq's alleged uranium purchases from Niger, which Blix called a scandalous forgery. He later told Britain's Chilcot inquiry in 2016 that, in his words, alarm bells should have rung when inspections failed to find weapons of mass destruction, and that the intelligence used to justify war was poor. Blix maintained that the war was illegal under international law, saying a second UN Security Council resolution authorizing military action was required, and it had never been sought. He criticized both the US and Britain for bypassing the UN process, something that we've seen another US president doing more recently. After the war, Blix emphasized that no weapons of mass destruction were found. Al Qaeda in Iraq did not exist before the invasion, and the war simply destabilized the region. Despite all this, Blair joined Bush in sending 46,000 troops to fight the war in Iraq. 46,000 troops is 1/3 of the total strength of the British Army. Only four countries, the US, Britain, Australia, and Poland, provided combat troops during the initial invasion. It's true that an extra 37 countries sent troops or logistical support after the invasion, though many of them provided minimal forces or only access to bases and overflight rights. The war in Iraq lasted 8 years, and while Britain still has a presence, mentoring and advising Iraqi security forces, combat operations ended in 2001, and the so-called coalition of the willing was disbanded. So what was the human cost of the Iraq war? We can't be absolutely sure, but total deaths are somewhere between 150,000 and 1 million. Now, it depends on the source that you look at, and also whether you include indirect deaths, not somebody being shot, but indirectly dying as a consequence of the war. Secondly, Iraqi civilian deaths somewhere between 183,000 and 405,000, again, depending on the source that you use, but probably at least the higher number due to underreporting. Um, Iraqi injuries up to 250,000. That's as reported by the Iraqi Human Rights Ministry. So, all these figures I'm using are taken from a wide variety of sources. 32,000 US military were wounded in action. Over 10,000 contractors were wounded or injured. The conflict also caused massive displacement, infrastructure collapse, and long-term health problems. So, for example, many parts of Iraq still have no electricity and no running water that they did have before the invasion. One undoubted consequence of Britain's involvement in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq was the bomb attacks in London by extremists on the 7th of July that killed 52 people and injured 770, making it the deadliest terrorist attack in British history. The coordinated attacks, some of you might remember, were at Aldgate Station on the Circle Line, Edgware Road on the Circle Line again, Russell Square on the Piccadilly Line train, and Tavistock Square, which is the double-decker bus you can see in this picture. The attacks led to a major shift in British counter-terrorism policy, emphasising the threat of homegrown extremism. In the aftermath, a manhunt followed, including the murder of Jean-Charles de Menezes, an innocent man murdered by police. He was a Brazilian man who was simply on his way to work when he had several bullets pumped into his head while sitting on a tube train at Stockwell Station. The police said they mistook him for a terrorist that they were tracking and falsely, as it later became apparent, said that they gave him a police warning before shooting him, and they shot him because he didn't reply. Several witnesses in that carriage have testified that this never happened. Armed police just rushed on the train and shot him. See, it doesn't just happen with ICE in America. In 2009, the new Prime Minister Gordon Brown established the Iraq Inquiry, commonly known as the Chilcot Inquiry, to investigate Britain's role in the war. It published its findings in 2016. It delivered a scathing attack on the British government under Blair. It concluded that Britain joined the invasion of Iraq before peaceful disarmament options had been exhausted, and that military action in 2003 was not a last resort. It said that the presentation of the dossier was misleading. It was designed to make the case for war, blurring the line between intelligence and political messaging. The inquiry found that Saddam Hussein did not pose an imminent threat to British interests, and that the intelligence on weapons of mass destruction was presented with unwarranted certainty. Tony Blair, in particular, was heavily criticised for overstating the threat from Iraq, relying on flawed intelligence and failing to adequately plan for the aftermath. The report noted that Blair had promised George Bush in July 22, I will be with you whatever, and that he did not press the United States for clear post-war plans. The inquiry also condemned the lack of a proper legal justification for war. It also found that Britain's intelligence services had an ingrained belief that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction despite no evidence, and that key intelligence was not properly vetted, notably from an informant later revealed to have lied. Despite the report's severity, no legal action was ever taken against the war criminal Blair, and he is now being touted as a member of Trump's peace plan for Gaza. It's like putting Jimmy Savile in charge of a children's home. At home, Tony Blair launched the Respect Agenda in September 2005, aiming to put the law-abiding majority back in charge of their communities by tackling antisocial behaviour through collaborative efforts between central government, local agencies, and citizens. The agenda was coordinated by the Respect Task Force, which was based at the Home Office and led by Louise Casey, former director of the Antisocial Behaviour Unit. Its core strategies included early intervention, addressing root causes of poor behaviour, and using tools like antisocial behaviour orders, ASBOs, remember them? Parenting orders, family intervention projects, and dispersal orders. Although the Respect Task Force was effectively disbanded in late 2007 after Gordon Brown had succeeded Blair as Prime Minister, many of its initiatives were integrated into the Youth Task Force Action Plan under the Department for Children, Schools and Families. So, like Thatcher and Major before him, Blair concentrated on misdemeanours committed by working class youth rather than the deadly crimes of the powerful. Not surprising, I suppose, for a privately schooled, educated upper middle class Prime Minister. Some of you may know that I did some research at the time on the moral panic about hoodies, and the kiddo in chief, Blair, was at the forefront of the moral entrepreneurs and agents of social control in condemning youngsters who wore hooded tops. I personally appeared on a BBC Two programme called Growing Young on this at the end of the noughties, and you can see a short clip of my interview on my YouTube channel. Supporters of the Blair years point to the fact that he was the first leader of the Labour Party to win uh, three successive general election victories, winning again in 2001 and 2005. But what people who tell you this don't tell you is that Labour's share of the vote, as well as the absolute numbers who voted Labour, fell both times and then fell again in 2010 under Gordon Brown when they were finally beaten by the Tories. It's also worth noting, as you can see from this graph, that in 2017, Labour under Jeremy Corbyn got a greater share and a greater number of votes than Blair did in 2005 and Gordon Brown did in 2010. Blair stepped down in 2007 and was replaced as Labour leader by Gordon Brown, his Chancellor. Brown was slightly more to the left of Blair and did do some good things, such as, and something that's close to my heart, brought in the blacklist regulations. But like most of the legislation under his leadership, it was weak. Although Brown initially enjoyed a significant lead in the polls, it didn't last long. In 2008, there was the financial crisis, which marked a pivotal moment in UK economic history, triggering the deepest recession since the Second World War. I've got loads of notes on, what caused it all, but I won't go into them all. But you all remember things like Woolworths and MFI collapsing on the high street, and but the long-term consequences of all this have been profound. Despite 8 years of economic growth now, the UK economy remains 16% smaller than it would have been had pre-crisis trends continued. And what the Brown and subsequent governments have done are just sticking plasters over a major crisis for capitalism. I mean, there were things like quantitative easing, which I won't go into, but all of them have just been sticking plasters. But because of this, in the 2010 general election, it ended in a hung parliament with the Tories with 306 seats, Labour with 258 seats, and the Liberal Democrats with 57 seats. After a lot of wrangling with the Lib Dems, having discussions with both Labour and the Tories, the Lib Dems formed a coalition with the Tories, with David Cameron as for the Tories as Prime Minister and Nick Clegg for the Lib Dems as Deputy Prime Minister. And one of the things that we should remember is that during the election campaign, Nick Clegg had consistently pledged that in the next Parliament he would vote against any increase in tuition fees for university students. He repeated this several times in a television debate between the main party leaders, as well as touring university campuses all over the country, making personal promises to students. Students queued to vote for the Lib Dems in 2010 on the sole basis of this pledge. But once in government, he reneged on this pledge and supported the Tories' increase in university tuition fees from a maximum of £3,375 to £9,000, almost tripling the cap. It sparked widespread student protests, and I went on that major march with my students from the University of Bedfordshire opposing this, and it sparked the so-called Liar Liar campaign. So it just goes to show that so-called progressives like Lib Dems can never be trusted. The Chancellor, George Osborne, increased VAT to 20%, which affects the poorest in society more than the richest. He introduced austerity measures and made massive cuts in public spending. But as usual, along with France and the United States, he found the money to launch a military intervention to depose the Libyan leader, Colonel Gaddafi. At the 2015 general election, the Labour Party under Ed Miliband presented a slightly left of centre programme and suffered the biggest general election defeat since 1987, winning only 232 seats. The Lib Dems, luckily, were heavily punished by the electorate, especially for their lies over tuition fees, losing 49 of their 57 seats. In other words, they lost two-thirds of their seats. But Cameron was able to form a government without the support from the Lib Dems. Because the new UK Independence Party had got nearly 13% of the vote, quite an achievement for a new political party, on a platform of withdrawal from the European Union, and was supported by many Conservative and some Labour MPs. Cameron promised a referendum on the issue at the same time as stating his view that the electorate should vote no to withdraw from the EU. Though Nick Clegg resigned as Lib Dem leader and was replaced by Tim Farron, the most surprising and significant fallout from the 2015 general election was the election of Jeremy Corbyn as Labour leader by a massive majority of the membership following the resignation of Ed Miliband. Despite mass media opposition, unlike his predecessors, Jeremy Corbyn promised a radical socialist transformation of British society if elected to government, and he spent the next 2 years building a mass socialist party. But I think one of the things you should note from that election was the number of votes that Yvette Cooper got and Liz Kendall got, both appointed as ministers in Starmer's government. Liz Kendall appointed as a minister when only 4.5% of Labour members supported her in an election for the leadership. Um, under Corbyn, at over 500,000 members, the British Labour Party became the biggest socialist party in Europe. But we can see from these figures what has happened to Labour Party membership since Starmer became leader. Partly because people deserting the party in their droves, but also because of expulsions from the Labour Party. And I've put at the end 2026, it's estimated now to be below 250,000. And I've put an estimate because the Labour Party doesn't release membership figures now any longer. So it's a guess. Meanwhile, under pressure from UKIP and his own Tory backbenchers, the Prime Minister David Cameron had agreed to a referendum on the UK's membership of the EU. After a completely dishonest campaign led by Farage and Boris Johnson, the electorate, on a 72% turnout, voted by a narrow margin, 42% to 48%, to leave the EU. Cameron resigned and was replaced by Theresa May. With a large majority and confident of an even bigger majority against a Corbyn-led Labour Party, May called a general election in 2017. But as most of us will remember, Theresa May had miscalculated the mood of the electorate. The Labour Party got a massively increased number of votes, better than anything achieved by Labour since the 1960s, and came very close to beating the Tories under May. The outcome was a hung parliament, with the Tories getting 317 seats, 9 short of an overall majority. However, May managed to form a government with support of the Northern Irish DUP. Corbyn's massive turnaround of Labour's fortunes frightened the life out of the whole establishment. And so began a vicious campaign of vilification and undermining of Jeremy Corbyn by the whole establishment, which included the press, the BBC, Friends of Israel, and other Zionist organisations, as well as right wing forces inside the Labour Party. Labour Party Central Office coordinated this campaign to discredit him, with staffers at head office plotting against him at every turn. And Peter Mandelson, for example, said, I wake up every morning thinking, how can I undermine Corbyn today? All the establishment created and maintained the myth that Jeremy Corbyn, a lifelong campaigner against all forms of racism, was an anti Semite. Now, if you haven't seen it, you must watch this film, which was released 3 years ago. It is shocking the extent to which the establishment went to in order to discredit him. You can get this free on YouTube. It's called Oh Jeremy Corbyn, The Big Lie. Following repeated rejections of her proposed Brexit withdrawal agreement, May resigned. In 2019, Boris Johnson was elected as the new Tory leader and therefore became Prime Minister. As MPs blocked his no deal exit from the EU, he called a general election for December 2019. After the mauling that Jeremy Corbyn had got from a frightened establishment, Johnson won the election with an 80-seat majority, partially assisted by the Brexit Party formed earlier in the year and agreeing to only campaign in non-Conservative seats. In January 2020, Johnson took the UK out of the EU. After the Labour defeat in 2019, Jeremy Corbyn announced his intention to step down as Labour leader. He remained in the role for 4 months while the leadership election process took place. With 56% of the vote in the first round, Starmer became Labour leader. Starmer promised to continue with the policies that had been developed under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership. Then the COVID-19 pandemic struck. The government responded with national lockdowns, health programs, and once a vaccine had been developed, a vaccination rollout. However, as part of the capitalist class, the Tories weren't going to pass up this opportunity to make money out of the crisis. They were rocked by sleaze and one scandal after another. Those of you who live in West Suffolk, which I think is most of you, you probably all remember our very own West Suffolk MP and Health Secretary being shown on CCTV images groping and snogging his advisor in a Department for Health corridor. This was just 2 weeks prior to guidance on social distancing being eased. So there was guidance on social distancing when he did this. But Hancock also illegally gave contracts for supplying PPE equipment gave contracts to his mates who had no experience at all in this area, resulting in millions being wasted on equipment that was useless. I mean, he gave one contract to the landlord of his local pub because he was a mate. Thousands of people died because of his incompetence and his corruption. Then there was the case of Dominic Cummings, Johnson's chief advisor, driving from London to Durham and Barnard Castle during Britain's first national lockdown, claiming that the round trip was to test his eyesight after suffering coronavirus symptoms. The journey sparked widespread public outrage, with critics accusing him of breaking lockdown rules, whilst the rest of us, whilst others, including Johnson, defended the trip as responsible. The incident became a symbol of perceived hypocrisy and double standards, fueling a broader narrative of Tory sleaze, a term used to describe a pattern of unethical conduct, rule breaking, and lack of accountability within the Conservative Party. The scandal was amplified by Cummings' refusal to apologise, Johnson's initial support, and the subsequent revelation that the government had allowed similar breaches by others, such as in the Partygate scandal, with parties going on at 10 Downing Street whilst they were telling the rest of us to isolate ourselves. Despite personally receiving a fine for Partygate, Johnson refused to resign. It was only after the sex scandal involving Chris Pincher that led to mass resignations from Johnson's cabinet that he decided to announce his resignation. Liz Truss was elected as Tory leader and therefore became Prime Minister. She was, as you know, an absolute disaster, tanking the economy in just 50 days in office, making her the shortest lived Prime Minister in British history. She had appointed Kwasi Kwarteng as her Chancellor, who, it was said, was perfectly qualified for the role because he had a doctorate in economics. However, all you need to do is a little digging to discover that his doctorate was actually in economic history. And his doctorate was on the political thought of the recoinage crisis of 1695 to 97. Oh, yes, very relevant for today's economy, I'm sure. You know, they do like to big up their competence to rule us, don't they? And I'm talking about politicians generally. Um, so the hapless duo announced large-scale tax cuts for the richest in society, which was intended to stimulate growth, they said, and certainly not to line the pockets of all their rich friends and themselves. It prompted a collapse in share prices and the pound falling to its lowest ever rate against the dollar. It cost us, the taxpayers, an estimated between 30 to 65 billion pounds. They were forced to reverse the changes announced in the budget. Kwarteng was sacked and Jeremy Hunt was appointed as Chancellor. Hunt reversed the remaining vestiges of Kwarteng and Truss's mismanagement of the economy. And Truss became the most unpopular Prime Minister in British history, with her personal approval rating recorded in one survey as just 9%. Truss eventually announced her resignation as leader of the Conservative Party and as Prime Minister. However, there's one thing I want to say about this whole sorry saga, which demonstrated beyond any shadow of a doubt that the economy of a capitalist economy like our own is not controlled by the government, but is controlled by the spivs on the stock exchange, something that any future socialist government would be well advised to take notice of and plan to counter. The Tories then appointed Chancellor Rishi Sunak as Tory leader and Prime Minister unopposed. Yes, we had another Prime Minister who was elected by nobody. But that's okay because he was an ordinary chap, just like the rest of us, wasn't he? In fact, he went to a posh prep school, was privately educated at the exclusive Winchester College before going to Oxford University to read politics, philosophy, and economics. He then became an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, a hedge fund manager at several companies, and a multimillionaire, as well as marrying another multimillionaire. He was reported by The Guardian to have not declared a significant amount of his wife and family's financial interests on the Register of Ministers' interests, including a combined 1.7 billion shareholding in Infosys. Sunak and his wife live in Northallerton and owns several other homes, including a Mews house in Earl's Court in central London, a flat in South Kensington, and a penthouse apartment in Santa Monica, California. His wife was a non-dom until it was revealed in the media, after which she agreed to pay tax in the United Kingdom. So kind of her. Like Boris Johnson, he was also fined for breaking lockdown rules. When he was asked in a TV interview what he had to go without as a child, he replied, Sky Television. As I said, just one of us, really. He will be mostly remembered, though, for his disastrous gimmick called the Rwanda scheme that cost us, the taxpayers, 700 million and resulted in only 4 asylum seekers being voluntarily sent to Rwanda. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer had spent his time in opposition, gradually reneging on every one of the progressive policies that had been developed under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership that he had promised to keep. He also launched a vicious campaign and witch hunt against Jeremy Corbyn, all of his supporters, and anyone else in the Labour Party that had, in inverted commas, left wing views. Even those with mildly socialistic views were denigrated as trots and expelled from the party. Fake anti Semitism, in particular, was weaponized to expel anyone who opposed the genocide in Gaza and old fashioned racism of the nastiest kind, particularly against Diane Abbott, which was exposed by the Ford report. Again, much of this is shockingly revealed in this film, and once again, if you haven't seen it, please do watch it on YouTube. Nevertheless, when Sunak finally called an election in 2024, Starmer's Labour Party won by a landslide. However, it has to be remembered when we say a landslide that only 9.7 million people voted Labour compared to the 10.3 million that had voted for Corbyn in 2019, which was their highest total in the 21st century. And their vote share under Starmer's leadership was only 33.7%, the lowest for any governing party in British history. So the main reason that Labour didn't win the election was that Labour, the main reason was that Labour didn't win the election so much as the Tories, after years of sleaze, saw their vote absolutely decimated and with their number of MPs reduced to 135. So, as we all know, in office, Labour has moved further and further to the right to the extent that many of their policies are indistinguishable now from the other main parties. And you all know what's happened since the 2024 election. So I'll say no more and leave it there. And hopefully, you've got something out of that and enjoyed it. And I'll take questions now, Claire, or observations if people want to make them.
Okay, thank you for that, Jack. That was very informative, as usual.
Okay, right. Let me.
Um, I think let's have a look. People, I'll open up the. You can ask questions in the chat now. Katie's got a hand up, Jack.
Yeah. Hi, Katie. Katie.
Just pulled over. Just to say, that was absolutely fascinating, and it sort of really took me back, and because I wasn't that interested in politics really around the time of the Iraq War and the Gulf War, but I was aware of what was going on. So it was just really interesting to go back into that kind of process, what was happening then, and also the fact that, like, we've obviously had, it's been a difficult first 8 to 9 months with your party, and just hear it, just like a different perspective of hearing about the other parties and the things that have gone on in history, and Nick Clegg, and it's just, it's not. I think sometimes when you're in it, you're in all the drama of the crisis. You think it's the only time it's ever happened, but actually, politics is what politics is like, and it's always been like this. It probably always will be, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that's what I got from that. But yeah, absolutely fascinating, brilliant, and to talk. I mean, going back into even just to the recent stuff with Matt Hancock, with the COVID stuff and the PPE. It was just really good, absolutely brilliant. Honestly, your talks are amazing. They're really, really good because I don't know that much about political history, so it's really good for me.
Oh, thank you very much, Katie. That's very kind of you. And one of the purposes of doing this kind of historical lectures over the last 5 weeks is for people to see that, you know, for example, the one of the things I said was about when there's a political crisis and the government are in trouble, what do? They find a war to go to.
Star War,
They start a war, yeah, or join the US in a war, one of the two, yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So there's
that's a bit worrying, isn't it, with how Starmer is at the moment?
it is it is clear, yeah, yeah. It is very worrying. You wonder what he's going to do next. Yeah. Okay. Has anybody else got another question or observation at all?
I'm just at the moment going through the funding forms for my daughter because she's going to uni in September, and Poppy, she's mildly autistic, so it's already a bit of a worry. But I was so stunned that it's 20,000 a year, 10 for tuition fees and 10 for the maintenance grant for them to, for their accommodation and food. It's just shocking to me that,
Yeah.
I mean, and this is across the board, isn't it, really? Whether you're working class or
Yeah.
your
Yeah.
family's doing well, I just hate Nick Clegg even more, because It's
Yeah.
just terrible, isn't it? Yeah. Who else has got their hands up? I can see some. Oh, Kevin's got his hand up. Oh, three others have as well. Sorry, who was
Oh,
first? Let's have a look. Um,
I'm not desperate, so do the others.
I think Kika was your hand up, and Jackie,
yeah.
Yeah, it's
and
just
then
Go to,
they're always just shown in the order.
yeah,
Usually they just come up in the order that people put their hand up. Yeah.
yes, kick
Yeah,
her,
so
please.
well, Jack, I mean that was just I'm so glad I joined. I mean I meant to join and then I got the reminder, so well done for posting that, Claire, just to remind us to join. Um it's so important to do this, to do this recap and just sort of remember, because all of this has formed our views, but it's putting this in context again before we embark on this critical mission of a century, to stop fascism in this country. And I think it's so important that we're educated. And so I thank everyone for doing it. I know you've had a whole series of these. You've also made me feel really quite old that some of these things, like not having to pay tuition fees when I didn't have to pay them, is sort of a historical thing.
You
So,
didn't you didn't have to pay them either.
no,
No,
no.
no. Well, when I went to university, which was very early 80s, I was a mature student. So not only did I not pay tuition fees, but I also got a maintenance grant. And my maintenance grant in the early 80s, which this was worth quite a lot of money, 4,200 £4,200 for the year. Also, I at that time, you can't now, I was able to sign on for unemployment benefit during when I wasn't at university. So taken all in all, I never got, well, I got a bit in debt, but I never got a lot in debt. Now I look at what, they don't get any maintenance grant. They can't sign on when they're not at university. They pay £9,000 in tuition fees, and then they've got to find money to live on, and so they get loans out and so on. And I think, it's just horrendous what youngsters have to pay now. Yeah.
okay, can we take Jackie next?
Sorry, I didn't ask my question yet. I
Oh,
was just
sorry,
saying
Kiko. I
that
thought
was
I
just
thought
a
we'd finished. All right.
that was just a thank you first.
Okay.
But I remembered, we you touched on Ed Miliband's election. In the 2015 campaign. And I remember at the time they were really pushing, there was this whole debate about, which is a constant debate, which I think is now laid to rest, this debate. But the debate was, if Labour is more right wing and closer to the centre, they're going to do better. And I think that election well and truly smashed that argument.
Yeah.
And then when Jeremy Corbyn then came in, absolutely clarified that it's the progressive left, it's the disenfranchised masses who would never vote Labour how they were. I remember how angry I was at Tony Blair, and I even, thought actually Nick Clegg saying some quite good stuff about mental health and he's against the war. But I just wanted to say that there was then a report, and what do you think about this? Later, Ed Miliband himself said he regrets not pushing for his what he thought they should have had a more left-wing agenda, but he
Yeah.
was pressurized to push it to the right. What do you think of that, or do you think they wouldn't have lost anyway? And um,
Well, um, I mean, one of the things that I take heart from is the fact that when surveys are done on individual policies, like nationalisation of some of our industries, like nationalisation of rail, the overwhelming majority of the population are in favour of it. And yet, you know, politicians say, and the media tell us, well, no, you can't do that because that's too left wing and people won't vote for it. But they will. They will if you put forward a radical program and it's sensible radical program, they will vote for it. Yeah, thanks very much, Keika, for your questions. And then it was Jackie, was it?
Yeah,
Just
hi.
coming. Hi,
Um,
Jackie.
hi. Really interesting, actually. Thank you. On point of the tuition fees, my youngest, he's 29, he's got £46,000 worth of debt from uni. And it's shameful, really, absolutely shameful. But that's that's what we've ended up with on that front. But what I wanted to say is, listening to you has been great. But all through history, all our governments have made the same mistakes and taken the same approach. It seems. And the only one chance we've had, two chances, right at the beginning after the war, when Labour were in, and they put so many plans in place that we're still benefiting from now, just. And now you've got Corbyn, who they, as you said, undermined and destroyed, really, to the
Mm.
point. Are I don't know what happens to people and when they learn from those mistakes. And who was it that rightly said about the war? If in trouble, they start a war, and they start a war illegally. They start it for gain, and it's it's the colonization of countries again, isn't it? Reaping all the minerals and everything else of benefit.
Yeah.
But how do we stop that? And part of me feels relieved when I think about our constitution, actually, and when we put in safeguards. But how does that stop? Will it ever stop what goes on once you're in government if you've got certain people, lobbies in place, basically persuading government with funds? Because that's what happens, isn't it?
Yeah.
At the moment, it's either corporations or Friends of Israel or whoever doing that. Sorry, it was just not really a question, but in a way, just a ramble.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's obvious that the thoughts are going round about what do
Yeah.
we actually do?
I
How do
mean,
we overcome these things?
and when do we learn from our mistakes?
Yeah. Well, it's when do the electorate learn from their mistakes and
I
you
do
know
believe with why the electorate is wiser now because of social media, because we've
yeah,
seen what's gone on in countries now, in Lebanon, in Israel, in all these countries. We are more, the ordinary man on the street is far more aware of the games that countries play.
yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things that gives me when you were talking about the way that they use wars. Um, I talked last week about hegemonic change from the 1960s. Uh, there was in the 1960s, because I lived through it as a teenager and as a young man, um, there was a kind of cultural revolution. There was a sexual revolution. There was a cultural revolution. As you know about hippies, it's when hippies developed in America and Britain. Because of that love and peace message, okay, it was utopian. And it's something that, socialists would say, well, that's all a bit wishy-washy and so on. The fact was, it was that kind of hegemonic or that kind of culture that prevented us from going into the Vietnam War because there was very strong pressure from America for Britain to join the Vietnam War. But it was young people in particular that said, no, we don't want to go to war. We want peace. We don't want war. So there have been successes. And, those kind of successes give me heart. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Kevin, you've got your hand up still. Thanks, Jackie, by the way.
Yeah, Jack, I'm interested in following up your point there about that he hegemony, and so how does that link back to to Tony Blair and what And you said a really interesting thing as well, which is like, when do the electorate learn from their mistakes? But surely they can't learn from their mistakes because of that hegemony is stopping them learning. So isn't that the point? How do you challenge that hegemony? And I feel like there was a chance to challenge it, and Corbyn missed that chance. That's what I feel, you know. So what are your thoughts on that hegemony and how that plays through what you've done,
Yeah.
what you've presented today?
Well, first of all, I don't think that Corbyn, with the Corbyn project originally through the Labour Party, I think that if Jeremy Corbyn has made any mistakes, one of them was, and he has made mistakes, one of them was underestimating the degree of opposition that he was going to get. And I don't think he's going to make that mistake again. Um, uh, the way you change the hegemony is, um, I mean, Katie and Claire talk a lot about working in the community, and that's one of the things that is kind of the basis of your party. I think we need to do a lot more work in the community because it's going to come through there. I don't think, and I've never thought, to be honest, that top-down socialism will ever work. It's got to come from the people upwards. And I think the idea of concentrating on, on community activities is probably the best way to go. But having said that, Kevin, I haven't got a magic wand no more than anybody else has. Okay, is that everyone, or was there anybody else wanted to come in?
Kika.
I just wanted to put a comment there, really, just to say that it came up yesterday when we were talking about the new book called Killing Corbynism, which is also a good one. Um, and we were discussing, oh, what do we do? What do we do about all this? How can we use Corbynism as a platform to build a new vision of hope? And, are we going to actually manage to do what they didn't do in the Weimar Republic and actually, build a massive socialist movement and party that can gain power and actually stop them? And we were discussing a few things, and people were talking about, oh, let's do this sort of litter picking and branded, we can wear high-vis things, and do community stuff. And I think we've got to be a bit careful and not be sort of too naive. We've got to sort of imagine we're up against the Nazis in the Second World War. I mean, we've got to sort of think ahead of how they get, how it's going to evolve very, very quickly to the point where we will get arrested at some point. And we've got to not be naive about how quickly it suddenly happens when fascism takes root. So, we don't want to be. So I just made this quite provocative comment, which was, I think Reform would love it if we go around picking up their litter from the councils they run and mess up. But we're doing all the sort of nice picking up litter. But I think we've got to think it's really important to do the community engagement mass transformation bottom up, but we've also got to think nationally and sort of really seriously have a sort of a very strong national or and community rooted vision, and just a like you said, the policies themselves, they're not even radical from the 2019 or 2017 manifesto. It's basically it does a lot of what they're already doing in sort of Germany and Scandinavia. It's not even, it's just it's not that radical. So I think those policies, we can even go further than those, and it will still be mainstream enough. So I think a two-tier, a community, but also on a national level, being really sophisticated in how we put forward a vision that's really compelling and use really state-of-the-art engagement and persuasion tools like marketing
Mm.
programs, like not to shy away from actually using communication.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry for the long.
No, that's all right. That's okay. I, when I'm talking about community-based things, I mean like campaigns to keep the local library open, or Um, as uh, somebody said to me today when I said that my local reform candidate here said one of his policies is to stop the boats, and I said perhaps I ought to keep writing to him, asking him what he's doing as my county councillor to stop the boats, because he's obviously trying to con the electorate now, because well, either that or he's I wouldn't put it past him that he doesn't know that county councillors don't have any power to stop the boats. Um, but yeah, I mean, fighting for local facilities and so on. But when I'm talking about working in communities, I mean, don't just set our sights on getting MPs elected. We need to fight on the streets. We not literally fight, but we need to fight at street level for the policies we want. Um, I think I said it the other week, I can remember Tony Benn talking in 1997 at Burston, and this was after Blair got elected. And the first thing he said when he got up on the stage was, "So you've elected a Labour government, so what? Do you think you're going to get socialism now?" You don't get socialism by electing MPs. You get socialism by fighting for it day in, day out in your communities. That's what kind of inspires what I was saying. But
Yes, totally agree.